So our first speaker tonight is Eric Wilson, who is now an independent scholar living in Nova Scotia, but has been for over 20 years on the Faculty of Law in Monash University, research in radical criminality, law and literature, natural law, phenomenology, post-colonial literature, radical orthodoxy, as well as mimetic theory. He describes himself, or he says he can be best understood as a critical, postmodern Augustinian Thomist. So
thanks.
Thank you very much, Wilson. And Eric, and please begin.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to pretty much just make it convenient for everybody. I'm just pretty much going to be reading out a shortened draft of an article that I've got coming out in Moscow Financial University's journal, coming out sometime the end of this year, early next year, as part of a larger project we're trying to get off the ground. So just here it goes. I did change the title of my presentation slightly. It's now called, this is the way the article will be appearing, Infinite Capital Accumulation Through the Endless Harvesting of Limitless Dead Souls. Criminogenic Asymmetries, Structural Inequalities, Mimesis, and Parallel Oligarchies. But basically it's about Trump and Putin, okay? So here we go. According to Alain Badiou, the world unexpectedly came to an end on November 8th, 2016, when Donald J. Trump was elected president of the United States. And this is Badiou. Everybody understands that the perpetuation of inequalities engendered by capitalism, and especially by the law of the concentration of capital, can hardly be a worthy destiny for human beings. Sartre used to say that if the human species were capable of no more than that, if the human species were capable of no more than that, it would leave no better memory of itself than that left by ants. Perhaps, replies the liberal, dominant today, but it's the only real possibility. Everything else is both worse and ultimately impossible. Look at Russia, look at China. The power of the liberal capitalist way lies in declaring itself to be the only way. It doesn't even need to declare itself to be the best way, since it has succeeded in convincing practically everybody that a second way doesn't exist. Ants we may be, perhaps, but better to be an ant than nothing. So what accounts for such an infantilized wailing and gnashing of teeth, wholly unbecoming for an intellectual of Badiou's caliber? On the one hand, it is a simple expression of a political phobia of the left that has reached pathological intensity over the past decade, the alleged resurgence of populism, which is ironic, really, as populism in its classical form evolved in the US as a fairly radical form of direct democracy. The deeper and more plausible explanation for the obsession is the recent history of Eastern Europe and of Russia itself that totally confounds the left. That right-wing nationalist populism has emerged as the most effective bulwark against globalization, once again removing socialism from its self-assumed prominent position within history. So paraphrasing Heidegger, the political destiny of the peoples of the West will be some variant of neo-authoritarianism, either elitist technocratic neoliberalism or rightist neopopulism. The former, already effectively realized, with the latter, the minoritarian, drawing dialectical sustenance from the former, the majoritarian. The real cunning of history at work in all of this is that the evolutionary logic of capitalism itself provides the means for the infinite postponement of socialism. The formation of that mass identity, which was supposed to herald the unstoppable rise of a universal proletariat, has been effectively re-engineered by neoliberalism to create impenetrable blobs of digital populations which are empowered to undertake authentic revolutionary transformation, the decomposition of socius into contending online consumers. Entire peoples labor under the apprehension that the resources for continuing to assume their identities are spent. They maintain that an outside no longer exists, such that to protect themselves against threats and dangers, the enclosures must be multiplied. And this in turn feeds directly into the global revenge of the hitherto marginalized copycat states. I'll talk about that below. Neopopulism and neoprotectionism as a way of erstwhile imitators to avenge themselves on their would-be models by revealing the latter's unattractive defects and irksome hypocrisy. A race to the top of the new neoliberal order through the symmetrical race to the bottom of post-democracy. Because of their respective geopolitical weight, the states that used to be known as communist adopted local variations or parodies of the mirroring process. For the Warsaw Pact, it was the unveiling of the authoritarian truth of the European Union. For Russia, it was the entirety of international public order. And for China, it was a redoubling of an almost autistic form of cultural narcissism. But the real news is that the US itself responded in kind as a hegemon model, given that this is a process of double mediation, but in an utterly bizarre way. It proved its unmediated relationship to the object of a now illiberal neoliberal hegemony by demonstrating its own Americanist capacity for a form of neo-authoritarianism. So here's how it works. Oh, the cat might be coming in. Here's how it works. It's all about mimesis, presumably the bad variety, but perhaps more interestingly, an originally good kind, now working in a perverted form. In any event, the West has only itself to blame. Whether we care to admit it or not, thanks to René Girard, we can no longer refuse to acknowledge the centrality of scapegoating, affectivity, and mimesis to the sausage making of secular or profane politics. As Achille Mbembe reminds us, enmity now constitutes the spirit of liberal democracies, and hatred gives them the impression of experiencing a pure present, a pure politics, using means that are themselves pure. And of course, we can shorthand that as social media. That is in large part due to the acceleration of a by now truly globalized neoliberalism that calls for neo-authoritarian political structures in order to enforce all of the means necessary to police the purity of the radically free market. At its core, liberal democracy is not compatible with the inner logic of global finance capitalism, continues Mbembe. Although this should perhaps be amended to democracy is incompatible with the inner logic of finance capitalism. Liberalism as neoliberal technocracy is fully compatible with the universality of high velocity free trade. But this leads to the return of a strange form of political atavism. The clash between these two ideas and principles is likely to be the most significant event of the first half of the 21st century political landscape, itself shaped less and less by the rule of reason and more by the general release of passions, emotions, and affect. Whether human civilization can give rise to any form of political life at all is the problem of the 21st century. When we think about it rationally, we realize immediately that the death or Aufgehoben of liberal democracy is neither the end of history nor the end of politics. It is rather the revalorization of an elemental politics, one, however, that is highly vulnerable to authoritarian machinations, particularly through the means of big tech and big data. But less appreciated is an equivalent centrality of mimesis and imitative rivalry to the realm of international politics, territory pioneered by Hans J. Morgenthau himself, who defined power as a, quote, psychogenic condition which rested on intersubjective relations. Power was for Morgenthau generally created through the interaction of people as a result and quality of human action, The irreducible affectivity of the political and of the mimetic nature of political affectivity enables mimetic theory to point international relations toward the need for a relational ontology of human desire and political order. The equation is simplicity itself. Power equals social recognition, power equals love, love equals desire, and desire equals social recognition, which equals power, desire, and love. Power and love are intimately connected, the desire for one growing out of the fulfilled or frustrated desire for the other, one state shading imperceptibly into the other, and the longing for immortality. For the perpetuation of one's existence beyond its natural limits intermingles with the desire for power and love. More concretely, power as prestige, which is a form of illusion, constitutes the supreme mimetic object of international politics, at least in its classical realism form. The lust for power is interrelational, which for Morgenthau means that the political in the specific sense consists on the particular degree of intensity of the connection created by the state's will to power between its object and the state. Politics is neither an either-or state of affairs, but always a matter of degree, necessarily depending on how intense and potentially violent a conflict had become. In whatever disguises it may appear, its ultimate essence and aim is one of these particular references of one person to another. Which leads us directly to our next major problem, power and the crisis of undifferentiation, or how can any state retain its sense of uniqueness or singularity within an accelerationist global political economy of complex interdependence? To put it another way, how does a state that lacks prestige resolve the ontopolitical crisis inflicted upon it through its love of the model? The state that is the holder of prestige that all other states naturally gravitate towards through the desire for social recognition, the psychic or propagandistic fuel of mimesis. According to Pierre Bourdieu, social identity lies in difference, and difference is asserted against what is closest, which represents the greatest threat. Not a game of zero sum, but an erotically driven strategy of structural positioning. Now, shifting gears slightly, the internal political logic of this integrated world system that I've been describing is governed through arguably best understood as being governed through the mechanism of hegemony, which Wallerstein and Arrighi define in a very precise way. Hegemony is something more and different than dominance, pure and simple. It is the additional power that accrues to a dominant group by virtue of its capacity to lead society in a direction that not only serves the dominant group's interests, but is also perceived by subordinate groups as serving a more general interest. If subordinate groups have confidence in their rulers, systems of domination can be governed without resorting to force. But if confidence wavers, they cannot. When such credibility is lacking, we shall speak of dominance without hegemony. The true hegemon, therefore, so if we go back through history, apply world system theory, and ask ourselves the question, who is the hegemon in that system at that moment in time? The true hegemon will always be that single state capable of effectively policing international public order through its convincing performance as being anti-imperialistic, meaning not dominating, not expropriating, cooperative, altruistic, sharing the net benefits of international political and economic cooperation. Now, the analytical tool devised by Wallerstein to identify the model state or hegemon within a particular world system at any given moment in time was the concept of geoculture or soft power, which is not at all dissimilar to Norbert Elias's concept of the civilizing process, now applied to international politics. This notion of hegemony as geoculture, or the bearer of soft power, as the universal model of social recognition, renders hegemony's practical operation inextricable from wider problems of its international legal legitimacy. Here is where geoculture is actively redeployed as a hopefully nonviolent means of international coercion. The hegemon as model will not only act as the embodiment of the effective ideal for the particular historical moment in question. Think of the France of Louis XIV in the 18th century, or Victorian England in the mid-19th century. It will also, through the calculated pollination of its cultural influence, bring all of the imitating states towards the commonly agreed goals, which ordinarily means their political and economic objectives. The true hegemon is the single state capable of policing international public order through performance of its anti-imperialistic function that most effectively manages the world economy on the basis of the mutuality of the greater and political practical interest or greater good for all. And in the 20th century, and now going to and maybe a possible transition in the early 21st century, this means or meant the United States and global neoliberalism. So trying to speed ahead a little bit. Yes, here we go. The operational linkage between hegemony and legitimacy and the correlative interdependency between hegemony and global capitalism dictates that the historically successful hegemons, all of them Protestant, the successive commercial republics of the United Provinces, the United Kingdom, and then the United States, united in all, which is actually significant in terms of constitutional theory, be both the most successful practitioner and the most persuasive advocate of political liberalism and free market economics during its prescribed period of hegemonic influence, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And it's precisely at this juncture that neoliberalism's lethal threat to democracy manifests clearly. The hegemon, as the most successful capitalistic state, will also serve as the model for the properly constituted international actor, leading all other states to behave as emulators with varying degrees of success. But the capitalist world economy is no longer a classical liberal one, but an anti-classical neoliberal one. Excuse me. Therefore, the mimetic nature of geoculture, the psychic component of the eternal quest for international recognition, will cause states to emulate, meaning to seize, the state which has realized most successfully the neoliberal ideal, which is simultaneously an anti-democratic ideal. Therefore, today's bearer of geoculture, which is the master sign of the model state within the international system, will be that state which has most successfully harmonized neoliberal substance with post-democratic or neo-authoritarian political form. And that means that the contest over hegemony can only be realistically assumed to be occurring between two states that, when we look at them through these lenses, turn out to be very weirdly twinned, each having an extensive history of hegemonic ambition, one wholly successful, the other partial. The United States, a multi-ethnic, post-colonial, liberal continental frontier society, post-democratic oligarchic republic, and the Russian Federation, a multi-ethnic, post-colonial, absolutist continental frontier society, neo-authoritarian oligarchy. So the more the things change, the plus it change. The unambiguous emergence of the US and Russia as mimetic doubles, both governed by an oligarchic authoritarian capitalism, the defining features of which I will define shortly, constitutes a localized transformation within a wider process following 1989. The transition of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact states, along with the PRC to a lesser degree, from prospective model to willing imitator within a now unipolar world system. Now, Ryszard Legutko, Polish member of the European Parliament, who adopts a robustly mimetic approach in dissecting the unipolar age of imitation, as he calls it, following the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, among the now leaderless Eastern European states, the deeper wisdom was to copy and imitate. The more we copied and imitated, the more we were glad of ourselves. Institutions, education, customs, law, media, language, almost everything became all of a sudden imperfect copies of the originals that were in the line of progress ahead. But the downside of all of this, and which came back to haunt us with a vengeance, was an interminable case of pathological resentment. In terms of Girard's singular version of mimetic theory, what we are faced with here is a double mediation. The success of the model, the mediator of the ideal to the world at large, in thwarting the mimetic desire of the subject emulator increases, not decreases, the mimic's or copycat state, existential intensity, or metaphysical desire, so that by persisting in his will to acquire the object, the disciple will become in turn a model obstacle to his mediator. For Girard, each member of the mimetic dyad becomes the imitator of his own imitator and the model of his own model. Each tries to push aside the obstacle that the author places in his path, which succinctly explains the apparent rise of the so-called far right in the post-GFC Europe of the East. So here we go. And this is from Legutko, a Polish delegate to the European Parliament. The imitation of moral ideals, unlike the borrowing of technologies, makes you resemble the one you admire, but simultaneously makes you look less like yourself at a time when your own uniqueness and keeping faith with your group are at the heart of your struggle for dignity and recognition. And of course, he means within the international sphere. This self-contradictory request to be both an original and a copy was bound to be psychologically stressful. A feeling of being treated disrespectfully was also fomented by what can reasonably be identified as the central irony of post-communist democracy, promotion in the context of European integration. The Central and East European countries, ostensibly being democratized, were compelled, in order to meet the conditions for EU membership, to enact policies formulated by unelected bureaucrats from Brussels and international lending organizations. Pretending to rule themselves while being ruled by Western policymakers was bad enough. The last straw was being disparaged by visiting Westerners, I actually witnessed this myself, who accused them of merely going through the motions of democracy. When that was exactly what political elites in the region thought they were being asked to do. Now, while it is debatable how much ressentiment objectively alters the world system outside of the geocultural, it is beyond doubt that the rhetoric of humiliation is central to the rightist radicalization of the domestic politics of the copycat states. And given the intensely mimetic nature of geoculture, coupled with the hyper-competitiveness of neoliberalism in its own right as a form of political economy, this outcome could not be otherwise. A failure of securing recognition, a permanent humiliation, structurally embedded within the international politics, spawns systemic ressentiment. Every nation that becomes a copycat is unavoidably subject to mimetic rivalry because the imitator is inevitably focused on the source of importation, an object of imitation by definition, and reacted to it. Because the model was superior to the imitator in the latter's own perception, its being a model implied that, and the contact more often than not served to emphasize the latter's inferiority, the reaction commonly assumed the form of ressentiment. And it is specifically ressentiment, not merely vengeful rivalry or ultra-nationalist competitiveness, that is at issue, because the dilemma for the loser is both existential and normative. The even crueler paradox is that the imitator can never escape the shaming gaze of the model, for in the case of the EU, the mediator of the model is the United States, because by definition, their mimicry will always remain second rate, as far as the cannibalistic heirs of 2 world wars were concerned anyway, which was how, in the end, Greece became Atlantis. The logic of reciprocity being what it is, a retaliatory reaction from the imitator was bound to happen, an escalating intensification of imitation. The subject of desire emulates the object more successfully than does the model mediator. The catch here is that for the former communist states to outrival either the EU or the US, or both, they have to prove the true nature of the object, the hegemony, is not liberal democratic, but what? Illiberal authoritarian, which, thanks to neoliberalism, is the truth of the model they seek to copy. Naturally, this is something supremely easy to say or to do with a technocratic, managerial, elitist EU. And is there any in the world today, any international organization as neoliberal, neo-authoritarian, technocratic, managerial, elitist than the European Union? I don't think so. So here's the joke, and it's all a joke. Precisely because, world historical joke. Precisely because the EU is the single largest international organization of exclusively copycat states, the West, who of course, even though the French will kill themselves before they admit it, model themselves more or less on the United States. It comes as no, so they themselves are copycats, dishing it out to the Eastern European inferiors. Precisely because the EU is the single largest international organization of exclusively copycat states, it comes as no surprise that it reflects the order and spirit of liberal democracy in its most degenerate version. Just as with the Japanese, another formerly occupied people supremely adroit at imitation, the Eastern Europeans as imitators perceive the truth of the model mediator with transcendental insight. In order to resolve their crisis of social recognition within the international sphere, they must reconstitute themselves as the new model by becoming even more undemocratic and more corrupt than the EU itself. What's more, they are ideally suited to exploit the reams of evidence provided by Europe, explicating the multiple convergence of parallel oligarchies and reciprocating forms of power crimes. The political manifestation of equally parallel Eastern and Western neoliberal criminogenic forms as proof of the equality and debasement, linking the model with the mimic and allowing the latter to overcome the former. And if this is the true dynamic governing the mimetic criminogenic neoliberal rivalry between the EU and the ex-Soviet bloc states, who are mere regional hegemons at best, how much more existentially intense must the rivalry be between the two legitimate global hegemons, which is once again the US and Russia? Time?
Yeah.
Jeremiah, am I out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, that's where MAGA comes from. MAGA is the American reverse engineering of this process. Trump made America great again. And by the way, the key word in MAGA is not again, but great, meaning competitive. It's about competition. It's not about racism or nationalism or xenophobia. It's about a competitive reboosting of America within a neoliberal world system, openly in your face, acknowledged as such, which means that the United States is getting better and better at imitating Russia, who is arguably, in terms of geoculture, remember, geoculture and the imitative and the performative and mimetic is perhaps arguably, from a Girardian perspective, today the true hegemon, the most successful, debased and corrupt neoliberal, neo-authoritarian state, which is our collective future, in either a populist form or a neo-authoritarian form, right or left, Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. It's the same game because we're all embedded in the same system with the same, governed by the same mimetic logic. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. The sort of yeah, it's a very good paper. Someone just wrote that also, but I guess what I'd really like to know, and we don't have a lot of time, but where do we go from here then? Do you have any prescriptive?
I've got a one-page conclusion. Can you just read it? Because I think it contains it. It'll take me 1 minute. So here's how it works, part 2. From 1918 to circa 1980, the U.S. as hegemon, hi, I got a cat in here. The U.S. as hegemon, it's the family cat, manifested and enforced the geoculture of neoliberal, the U.S. as hegemon manifested and enforced the geoculture of liberal internationalism and neo-Keynesianism, touted as the right side of history, humanitarian intervention et al., all that Hillary Clinton crap, right? But seen in hindsight as a temporary deviation from an underlying but repressed dynamic of unrestricted, globalized, primitive accumulation, the economic is criminogenic. This began to change between 1979 and 80, as we know, Thatcher Reagan, with the neoliberal revolution within the core zone and the hegemon itself, which was not in fact revolutionary, but quintessentially reactionary, the return to that which had been repressed. Hence the unbounded economic rape of Eastern Europe by Western Europe, the EU, after 1989. The newly liberated emulators of the thing once known as the West, precisely because they were new to the game and were hyper-mimetic, were very quickly able to get ahead of the curve. Neoliberalism is inherently anti-democratic and naturally favored some form of neo-authoritarian political system, either technocratic or populist. Here is the uncanniness of it all. Precisely because they were able to internalize neo-authoritarianism within a neoliberal global economy, most rapidly and most completely, the eastern states of Europe were the ones best able to claim the hegemonic mantle of geoculture, the master sign of the model. And the United States is the hegemon and therefore the state most subject to challenges from rivals, undertook internal competition to its next logical level of intensity by voluntarily undergoing its own neo-authoritarian transformation in response to its Eastern rivals. Rightist neo-populism with the Republicans and technocratic elitism for the Democrats. What holds everything together in this entangled self-perpetuating chaos is the triangulation of mimetic desire. Both the US and Russia, both neo-populists and neo-technocrats, both Republicans and Democrats, both Trump and Putin, all of them the bastard spawn of a globalized neoliberalism, strive for the same object of their concurrent and convergent mimetic desire, neo-authoritarian, post-democratic, neoliberal order. The way out, the solution, you asked me about, my last sentence, bring on AI.